there was a dish that once appeared on almost every dinner table in America, once fed millions of families after the war, and yet today, very few people under 40 years old still know what it really is. The strange thing is that, with only about $1, a mother could turn a few slices of stale bread, one can of cream soup, some potatoes, and a little leftover meat into a dinner enough for all 6 people. It sounds unbelievable, but that was once a very normal life. What is even more surprising is that many of those dishes are now brought out to be laughed at, even though they themselves helped so many families get through the days before payday. Tonight, we will open that dusty recipe box again, and very possibly, by the end of the video, you will understand why an old baking pan was once worth more than any luxurious dish. One baking pan, and the whole family had dinner. That baking pan still lives in my memory, slightly bent at one corner, its metal surface dulled by many years of going in and out of the old oven. Every time I opened Grandma's tin recipe box, I would see the recipe cards that had turned yellow with age, their edges stained with butter, marked by dried streaks of cream of mushroom soup, and carrying the lingering smell of roasted onions that somehow still clung between the handwritten lines blurred by time. It was not the memory of a luxurious meal. It was the memory of small kitchens that raised an entire generation with resourcefulness more than money. In 1954, in Dayton, Ohio, a wife quietly walked into the kitchen after finishing her shift at the factory when it was already completely dark outside. The radio on the shelf still crackled with the evening news. Her husband's work jacket was still draped over the back of a chair. On the table there was only half a loaf of white bread costing about 16 cents, a few potatoes left in a paper bag, one 10-cent can of cream of mushroom soup, 3 eggs. A little ground beef bought that morning for about 43 cents per pound, and the baking pan that had been with the family for many years. She never called the dish by any fancy name. She simply smiled and said, "Tonight we're having casserole." The potato slices were arranged first. The stale bread was torn into small pieces. A thin layer of ground beef was scattered over the top, followed by a few spoonfuls of cream soup and a handful of crushed crackers. A sheet of aluminum foil covered the pan, the oven door closed, and the kitchen slowly filled with the aroma of a dinner taking shape. The women of those days knew exactly how to stretch every ingredient. They knew how many servings one can of soup could provide. They knew that 1 pound of ground beef would feed the entire family if it was served with potatoes, noodles, rice, or stale bread. They also knew that the golden, crispy corner of the casserole was always the part that the children looked forward to most. If kitchens like these remind you of your mother, your grandmother, or a simple dinner once placed on a wooden table that no one ever thought to photograph, subscribe to the channel right now. Throughout this journey, you will discover dishes costing under 40 cents that could feed 6 people. The canned tuna casserole that saved countless families after the war, the cabbage casserole that appeared everywhere from church gatherings to weekend potlucks, and the number one casserole costing only about $1 for an entire pan that became a symbol of the Midwest. In those kitchens, the baking pan never held only food. It held a mother's peace of mind before payday, held warmth inside the home after a long day's work, and made sure the whole family left the dinner table with full stomachs. Tonight, the old recipe box will be opened once again, and every story begins with slices of stale bread. Stale bread wasn't thrown away. It was turned into dinner. There were slices of bread that had lost the aroma of being freshly baked, with dry crusts and slightly chewy centers, yet in many American kitchens in 1954, they still rested quietly inside a paper bag in the corner of the table. The mother would walk by, open the bag, gently squeeze each slice, and smile softly. She knew there was still a way to make dinner that evening. As long as there were a few eggs left in the cupboard, a little milk at the bottom of the bottle, some softened butter, and half a can of soup, the baking pan would once again be placed into the oven. Stale bread was never considered something to throw away. It was the strongest foundation of countless dinners. Number 25. Bread and butter bake was the clearest proof. One loaf of white bread cost about 16 cents. Eggs were about 60 cents a dozen, and with a little leftover milk and butter, the entire pan still cost under 40 cents. The mother tore the bread into hand-sized pieces and arranged them across the buttered bottom of the pan. The eggs were beaten together with milk, salt, and pepper, then poured evenly over the top. If there were a few fried onions, a little shredded cheese, or a piece of leftover ham, she sprinkled them on to give the dish a richer aroma. After baking, the top turned lightly golden with a delicate crispness, while underneath it became soft and rich like a savory custard. Dinners like these usually appeared before payday, when the meat was almost go. Fresh bread had already run out. The whole family sat down at the table, served themselves steaming portions, and quietly finished every bite. One slice of stale bread, when placed in the right hands, was still enough to keep the entire dinner table at peace. As soon as that pan had been cleared away, number 24, beef biscuit casserole, brought a different aroma into the kitchen. Ground beef costs about 43 cents per pound, but the mother usually used half a pound, added one 10-cent can of soup, a little onion, and biscuit mix to make a pan costing about 55 to 65 cents. The beef was browned until fragrant, then mixed with the soup before being covered with spoonfuls of biscuit dough. As it baked, the biscuit topping rose and absorbed the meat juices beneath it, making the entire pan look much more filling. A father returning home after a long work shift needed only one hot serving like that to regain his strength. Then came number 23, mock chicken cracker casserole, a dish born from cracker crumbs that seemed to have no value left. One box of crackers costing about 19 cents, one 10-cent can of cream of chicken soup, and a little milk were enough to make an entire pan for under 35 cents. The cracker crumbs from the bottom of the box were crushed and mixed with the cream soup, pepper, and butter. If there was a little boiled chicken left from the previous day, the mother shredded it and added it in. But if there was not a single piece left, the aroma of the cream soup still made the kitchen smell as though roast chicken were in the oven. The crumb topping turned golden and crisp, while the filling underneath stayed hot and rich, enough to make the children forget that the refrigerator was almost empty. It was from those stale slices of bread and those humble cracker crumbs that countless families made it through the final days of the month. But what truly made the baking pan feel heavier was still waiting beneath the kitchen cabinet, inside the paper bag filled with potatoes. Potatoes, the ingredients that made the pan look fuller. The paper bag of potatoes beneath the kitchen cabinet always brought a special sense of reassurance. As long as there were still a few firm potatoes in the house, the mother believed she could still put dinner together. Around 1955, a 5-pound bag of potatoes usually cost only about 29 cents, far less than meat. She picked up a small knife, peeled them, sliced them evenly, and arranged them inside the baking pan that had already been warmed. Potatoes were never the most remarkable dish on the dinner table, but they quietly held the entire meal together. Number 22, baked potatoes and eggs always began with potato slices so thin that the light almost shone through their edges. With only a few potatoes, 3 to 4 eggs, a little milk, and some seasonings, the entire pan still cost under 40 cents, enough to feed 5 to 6 people when served with bread. The eggs were beaten smooth and poured over each layer of potatoes, with a few slices of
That?
onion tucked between them if any remained in the basket. After baking slowly, the potatoes became tender and fluffy, the eggs set just right, the top of the pan turned golden brown, carrying the aroma of butter. The father would often ask for another piece, while the mother quietly cut the smallest portion for herself, just as so many mothers of that era did. From that simple baking pan came number 21, cheesy potato casserole, filling the entire kitchen with the scent of warm milk and melted cheese. One package of American cheese costs about 25 to 35 cents, and with potatoes, milk, and butter, the entire pan came to about 55 to 70 cents. The potatoes were partially boiled before being covered with a smooth, creamy sauce and placed into the oven. When the oven door opened, the edges of the pan bubbled with a rich golden color, and the sound of a spoon scraping up the crispy browned layer always made the children look up with eager anticipation. Then came number 20, layered ground beef and potato casserole, proving that potatoes truly knew how to share the burden with a small amount of meat. Ground beef costs about 43 cents per pound, but the mother used only half a pound, adding potatoes, onions, and one 10-cent can of tomato soup to create a baking pan costing about 55 to 65 cents. The potato slices absorbed the sauce and the meat juices throughout the baking time, making every spoonful taste richer than the actual amount of meat it contained. Closing this chapter was number 19, hash brown potato and cheese casserole. The potatoes were shredded, squeezed dry, and mixed with one 10-cent can of cream soup, milk, and cheese before cracker crumbs were sprinkled across the top. By the end of the 1950s, this baking pan usually cost under $1 and appeared frequently at potlucks and Sunday dinners. The center was smooth and creamy, the top was crisp and fragrant, and the deeply browned corner of the pan was always the first part to disappear. Potatoes had fulfilled their purpose, making the baking pan fuller, heavier, and capable of feeding the entire family. Yet all it took was one package of ground beef in the kitchen for the aroma of dinner to change completely, signaling a new chapter of casseroles waiting just ahead. 1 pound of ground beef stretched across an entire baking pan. The butcher wrapped the ground beef in white paper, neatly twisting both ends before sliding it across the counter. The mother held the package with both hands as though she were carrying home something precious. Around the middle of the 1950s, ground beef cost about 43 cents per pound, so no one thought about placing a large piece on every plate. Every handful of meat was divided into smaller portions and mixed deeply into noodles, potatoes, beans, corn, and sauces. It was the baking pan that accomplished what a serving of meat by itself never could, stretching 1 pound of meat across dinner for the entire family. Number 18, poor man's lasagna, carried that idea perfectly. One package of dried pasta costing about 15 to 20 cents, one can of crushed tomatoes costing 10 to 15 cents, a few slices of American cheese, and a little ground beef created a baking pan costing about 60 to 70 cents. The pasta was boiled until just tender and arranged in layers. The ground beef, browned with onions and tomato sauce, was spread thinly between each layer of pasta before being topped with cheese. When the cheese melted in golden in patch, yes, and the red sauce gently bubbled around the edges of the pan, no one cared whether it was authentic Italian lasagna or not. To that family, it was a complete dinner. Right after that came number 17, shipwreck casserole, a baking pan that gathered almost everything left in the kitchen cupboard. Potatoes, onions, canned beans, tomatoes, and half a pound of ground beef were arranged layer upon layer, bringing the total cost to about 70 to 80 cents. When the serving spoon reached the bottom, all the ingredients blended in rising steam. It looked a little messy, but it filled every stomach. The name shipwreck casserole sounded playful, yet the dish itself stood as proof of the ingenuity of homemakers who knew how to make use of everything they had. Then came number 16, ground beef and corn casserole. The bright yellow color of one can of corn, costing about 12 to 15 cents, made the entire baking pan come alive. The corn mixed with ground beef, soup, and breadcrumbs before being placed into the oven. The natural sweetness of the corn kernels made the small amount of meat taste more tender and flavorful, and the children ate happily without ever noticing just how far the meat had been stretched. Closing this chapter was number 15, chili mac casserole. One package of macaroni costing about 15 to 20 cents, canned beans costing about 12 to 15 cents, canned tomatoes, and half a pound of ground beef created a baking pan costing about 70 to 80 cents, enough for 2 dinners if everyone ate carefully. Chili powder, onions, and tomatoes filled the kitchen with a rich aroma, even before the oven door was opened. The bold seasonings gave the dish its own character while allowing the smaller amount of meat to still produce a satisfying dinner. Yet there were still weeks when even that much ground beef became a luxury. At those times, the mother would look up at the shelf filled with canned goods and know that family still had another path forward. Canned were aunts, a lifeline before they became the butt of jokes. The wooden shelf in the corner of the kitchen always held a few neatly arranged cans. The mother only had to look up to know that her family still had a way to make it through the final days of the month. Around 1955, a can of tuna, a can of Spam, or a can of cream of mushroom soup was not considered a luxury. Yet each one brought a sense of reassurance. Snow might have been piling up outside the window, payday might still have been several days away, and the butcher shop at the market might have closed hours earlier, but dinner could still begin with the steady sound of a can opener turning across the metal lid. Number 14, tuna noodle casserole, was born from that familiar sound. One can of tuna costing about 29 cents, one 10-cent can of cream of mushroom soup, one package of egg noodles costing about 20 cents, and a little green peas costing about 15 cents, created a baking pan costing about 75 cents to $1, enough to feed 6 people. The tuna was carefully drained before being mixed with the noodles, cream, soup, and milk, then topped with crushed crackers. When the baking pan came out of the oven, the top was lightly crisp, the filling underneath was rich and creamy, and the aroma of tuna, blended with the soup, filled the entire kitchen. That alone was enough for everyone to know that no one would leave the dinner table hungry that night. Next came number 13, Spam and rice casserole. One 12-ounce can of Spam costs about 45 to 50 cents, and with rice costing about 10 to 15 cents, along with a little canned vegetables or cream soup, the entire baking pan comes to about 85 cents to $1. The canned meat was cut into small pieces and browned in a skillet until the edges became crisp before being mixed with the rice. Every spoonful of rice contained just enough pieces of Spam to carry its savory flavor and meaty aroma. Years later, Spam became the subject of countless jokes, but for working families of that time, that small can had once made it possible to put dinner on the table. Then came number 12, salmon noodle casserole, making the dinner table feel a little more special. One can of salmon, costing about 25 to 35 cents, together with dried noodles, cream soup, and milk, created a baking pan costing about 60 to 75 cents. The mother gently removed the soft bones before mixing the salmon with the noodles, a little yellow mustard. The pale pink color of the salmon stood out against the creamy sauce, making the children always believe that there was something special to celebrate that day. Closing this chapter was number 11, chicken biscuit bake. Leftover chicken or canned chicken was shredded and combined with one 10-cent can of cream soup. canned vegetables costing about 12 cents, and biscuit mix costing about 20 cents, before being topped with spoonfuls of biscuit dough that baked into golden mounds across the surface of the pan. As the biscuit topping rose and the filling gently bubbled around the edges, the kitchen immediately filled with the aroma of hot chicken. Those humble cans of food quietly helped countless families survive their hardest days. Yet even simpler baking pans were still to come, where cabbage, rice, and tomatoes would prove that a warm dinner sometimes did not need meat at all. Cabbage, rice, and tomatoes, ingredients so inexpensive that no one bragged about them, yet everyone ate them. There were evenings when the mother opened the kitchen cupboard and found no ground beef, no canned fish, and no cream soup left on the shelf. In front of her, there was only one head of cabbage costing less than 10 cents, a bowl of leftover rice from the day before, a dented can of tomatoes tucked into one corner, and a few slices of smoked sausage cut so thin that the light almost shone through them. Yet as the oven began to warm, the kitchen slowly filled with the aroma of butter, onions, and the scent of bread crisping around the edges. The simplest ingredients somehow entered the baking pan with quiet dignity, as though they had always been meant to be part of a proper dinner. Number 10. Thin sliced baked cabbage was the clearest proof. One head of cabbage costing about 10 cents, together with a little butter, milk, and breadcrumbs, made an entire baking pan for only about 25 to 30 cents. The mother sliced the cabbage into thin pieces, arranged them across the bottom of the pan, and poured a steaming white sauce over the top. As the cracker crumbs turned a light golden color, the sharp smell of the cabbage mellowed, giving way to a gentle sweetness that made many children finish every bite of their vegetables without a single complaint. That baking pan looked nice enough to bring to a church potluck without anyone feeling embarrassed. Next came number 9, tomato rice bake. The bowl of leftover rice was fluffed with an old fork before being mixed with a can of tomatoes costing about 10 to 12 cents, a little onion, and the small amount of grease left in the skillet. The entire baking pan usually cost 25 cents, but when it came out of the oven, the rice around the edges was wonderfully crisp, while the center glowed red and carried the rich aroma of tomatoes, making the dinner table seem brighter. It was a dish born from the habit of valuing every grain of rice and never allowing anything to go to waste. Then came number 8, cabbage roll casserole, appearing in many working-class families in Pittsburgh, Cleveland, and Chicago. Instead of spending time rolling each cabbage leaf by hand, the mother chopped the cabbage, mixed it with rice, canned tomatoes, and half a pound of ground beef costing about 22 cents, creating a baking pan costing about 70 to 90 cents. As the tomato juice soaked into every grain of rice and the cabbage slowly softened in the oven, the dish still preserved the familiar flavor of the original recipe, even though the preparation had changed to match a busier way of life. Closing this chapter was number 7, sausage and sauerkraut bake. One jar of sauerkraut costing about 10 to 15 cents, one package of sausage costing about 39 cents, and a little potatoes or rice created a baking pan costing about 60 to 75 cents. The sauerkraut was carefully drained, the sausage was sliced diagonally into thin pieces, and everything was baked until the edges became lightly browned. The smoky aroma blended with the tangy scent, filling the entire kitchen and letting anyone who walked through the door know that dinner was ready. From ingredients that few people would have proudly shown off, the mothers of that era still created baking pans that were warm enough, filling enough, and comforting enough to bring the whole family back together around the table. But before long, those kitchens began discovering new flavors, as cornmeal, chili powder, and baked beans carried the stories of distant places into a single baking pan. Cornmeal, Keely, and casseroles, borrowing their names from other regions. At some point, the baking pans in working-class kitchens no longer carried only the aroma of potatoes or cream soup. The moment the oven door was cracked open, the scent of chili powder spread throughout the room, blending with hot tomatoes and onions, gently bubbling around the edges of the pan. Some people had never set foot in Texas, much less eaten an authentic tamale, yet they remembered the smell of cornmeal drifting from the kitchen next door and brought that same aroma into their own homes in the simplest way possible. The mothers of those days did not learn recipes from cooking schools. They learned by watching, tasting, remembering, and turning whatever they had into a dinner families could afford. Number 6. Tamale pie came into being in exactly that way. Around the middle of the 1950s, beginning in Texas and spreading across many other states, a pan of tamale pie required only cornmeal, costing about 10 to 15 cents, canned tomatoes costing about 10 to 12 cents, canned beans costing about 12 cents, half a pound of ground beef costing about 22 cents, and a little chili powder to create a meal costing about 60 to 70 cents. The ground beef was browned with onions, tomatoes, and beans before being spread into the baking pan. A thick layer of cooked cornmeal was smoothed across the top, glowing golden like a thin blanket. When it came out of the oven, the crust was lightly cracked while the red sauce still bubbled around the edges, filling the kitchen with a warm, spicy aroma that somehow made the room feel brighter. It was not a traditional tamale, yet it became a very real memory for many American families. Next came number 5, sausage and baked beans casserole. One can of pork and beans costing about 15 cents, one package of sausage, costing about 39 cents, along with onions, yellow mustard, ketchup, and a little brown sugar, created an entire baking pan costing about 60 to 70 cents. The sausage was sliced into small rounds so it could be evenly distributed throughout the pan, while the beans became coated in a rich, glossy dark sauce after spending time in the oven. The smoky aroma, sweet flavor, and slight tang blended so perfectly that the children often asked for another spoonful before the adults had even stood up from the table. Weekend dinners, church gatherings, and meals in the backyard all once had a place for that humble baking pan. Then came number 4, potluck chili mac casserole. One package of macaroni costing about 20 cents, canned tomatoes costing 12 cents, canned beans costing 15 cents, ground beef costing from about 22 to 43 cents, together with a little chili powder and a few slices of cheese if any remained, made a large baking pan costing about 80 cents to $1.10. The macaroni was cooked until tender, then thoroughly mixed with tomato sauce, beans, ground beef, and onions before being covered with aluminum foil and carried to the church potluck. When the foil was lifted away, the rising steam carried the aroma of chili and tomatoes down the long serving table, where everyone stood holding a white enamel plate, waiting patiently for their turn. Every spoonful contained pasta, sauce, beans, and a little meat, perfectly balanced to feed an entire table of familiar faces from a single baking pan. Those boldly flavored dishes gave humble casseroles a personality all their own. Then another baking pan appeared, one that nearly every child in the Midwest could recognize at first glance, with a layer of ground beef on the bottom, cream soup in the middle, and rows of golden, crispy potato tots covering the top, announcing the dish that would become the number one memory of an entire generation. Number 1, tater, tot casserole, and the most valuable dollar ever spent. Some dishes need no lengthy introduction. The moment many Americans hear the sound of frozen potato tots tumbling onto a baking pan, they are taken back to the kitchen of their childhood. They remember the familiar click as the oven door closed, the aroma of cream of mushroom soup beginning to warm, the yellow light falling across the small wooden table, and the feeling of standing beside their mother, watching the crispy topping slowly turn a deep golden brown. Those baking pans never tried to become perfect meals. They simply accomplished the most important task of all, bringing a hot dinner to the table so the whole family could sit down together. Number 3, hot dog and macaroni casserole always made the children smile from the moment the knife sliced the hot dogs into little coin-shaped rounds that dropped into the bowl of macaroni. Between 1956 and 1959, one package of macaroni cost about 15 to 20 cents. An ordinary package of hot dogs cost about 35 to 45 cents, and with one 10-cent can of tomato soup or a few slices of American cheese, the entire baking pan came to about 70 to 85 cents. The macaroni was cooked until just tender, then mixed with the hot dogs and sauce before being poured into the baking pan and topped with breadcrumbs or cheese. When it came out of the oven, the top was lightly crisp while the inside remained soft and fragrant. After school, one full plate of this dish was enough to make the children's tired shoulders seem lighter because they knew dinner had truly begun. Number 2, green bean and mushroom casserole carried a different memory. Beginning in 1955, this dish appeared on countless dinner tables thanks to the combination of one 10-cent can of cream of mushroom soup, canned green beans costing about 15 cents, and crispy fried onions costing another 10 to 15 cents. A small baking pan usually came to about 40 to 50 cents. The green beans were mixed with the cream soup and a little milk before being topped with fried onions and baked. When served, the onions remained crisp while the sauce gently bubbled around the edges of the pan. It accompanied families to Thanksgiving dinners, church basement gatherings, large family reunions, and even meals served after funerals. That humble dish gradually became such a familiar presence that many people only realized its value after the years had passed. Finally came number 1, tater tot casserole, the baking pan that many people consider the symbol of the Midwest. During the late 1950s and the early 1960s, one bag of frozen potato tots cost about 29 to 35 cents, ground beef cost about 43 cents per pound, cream of mushroom soup cost 10 cents, canned green beans cost about 15 cents, and the entire family-sized baking pan ranged from about $1 to $1.15. The ground beef was browned with onions and spread across the bottom of the pan. Cream of mushroom soup mixed with milk was poured over it, followed by green beans or corn. And finally, the potato tots were carefully arranged in neat rows across the top. After baking, the golden potato topping gave off a gentle crunch when touched by a serving spoon, while underneath, the filling still simmered softly, blending the aromas of meat, soup, and onion. After a long day's work, the father often helped himself to another serving. The children competed for the crispiest corner of the potato topping, while the mother quietly watched the baking pan gradually empty and smiled. A dinner costing about $1 never made a family wealthier, but it was enough to create countless memories that people would still remember many decades later. Why those baking pans disappeared? Some recipes were never erased from the kitchen. They simply stopped being asked for. The baking pan still rested in the corner of the cabinet, its metal edges dulled by years of being taken out and put away again. Cans of cream of mushroom soup were still on the grocery shelves, potatoes were still sold by the bag, and pasta still came in the familiar paper boxes. Yet one day, people began believing that dinner could arrive more quickly through a new dinner mix, a frozen meal, or a package of ready-made seasoning. The oven door was opened less often, and the baking pans that had once raised an entire generation quietly faded into the background. Throughout the 1950s, casseroles were a skill passed down right there in the kitchen. The mother did not need to look at the clock or read every line of a recipe. She looked at what was left in the cupboard and knew exactly what to do next. She knew which cream soup went best with potatoes and which worked best with noodles. She knew that 1 pound of ground beef could fill an entire baking pan if she added rice, stale bread, or a few potatoes. If there was no cheese, she crushed crackers. If there was no soup, she whisked together milk, flour, and a little fat. It was knowledge gathered from hundreds of ordinary dinners, a skill that never appeared in advertisements but kept warmth on countless dinner tables. By the 1960s, everything began changing very slowly. In magazines, on the radio, and even on television screens, advertisements started promising a more modern kitchen. Women were told that they deserved to spend less time standing over the stove, less time stirring pots, and less time waiting for the oven. That truly helped many busy families. Yet at the very same time, many old skills quietly came to be seen as outdated, like an old apron folded neatly and tucked away in a drawer. Around 1975, many casseroles began carrying playful names such as mom food, church food, or too much cream soup. People criticized them for containing too much starch, too many canned ingredients, and for not looking attractive enough to belong on a modern dinner table. Few people remembered that those baking pans had never been created to impress anyone. They were created for the weeks when payday had not yet arrived, so that the whole family could still enjoy a hot dinner after a long day of work. Then came 1985, followed by 2000, and countless recipes still rested quietly inside old tin recipe boxes, in yellowed notebooks, or on the back of a soup label that had been carefully cut out and tucked between loose sheets of paper. The children still remembered the aroma of the food, the deeply browned corner of the baking pan, and the sound of the serving spoon scraping the crispy edges. Yet they no longer remembered how much milk their mother had poured in, whether she had crushed crackers or breadcrumbs, how long she had baked it, or when she had added the butter. The recipe was still there exactly as it had always been, but the hands that had once prepared it slowly disappeared. Perhaps what was truly lost was never just a few old casseroles. What disappeared was the calm confidence of a mother standing before an almost empty kitchen cupboard, still smiling, because she knew she had just enough ingredients left to make one more baking pan. And that is why, when people look back at these dishes, they do not see only cream soup, potatoes, tuna, or ground beef. They see the women who counted every cent, arranged every layer of ingredients with care, and placed a hot baking pan in the center of the table as a simple message that tonight the family was still going to be all right. It wasn't just an inexpensive dinner, it was how people said, "I love you." By now the kitchen had finally grown quiet. The oven slowly cooled after many hours of glowing with heat. The small radio on the shelf still crackled with its familiar sound, as though it was not quite ready to bring the long day to an end. The children had already left the table, carrying away their laughter and their spotless plates. The father quietly pushed back his chair and stood after a tiring day at work, while the mother silently carried the dulled baking pan to the sink. Along the edge of the pan, a layer of golden baked cheese still clung tightly and had to soak in hot water for a while before it would finally loosen. On the table, the old recipe card still rested in place, one corner stained with tomato, the butter marks having soaked deep into the paper fibers many years before. The 25 dishes we have just revisited all shared a humble appearance. They were never created to appear in beautiful photographs or become the centerpiece of a dinner party. They were born on evenings when only a few coins remained in the wallet, when there was very little meat left in the refrigerator, and when the clock kept ticking after a long day's work. In those moments, a baking pan did much more than keep food warm. It kept stale bread from being thrown away. It turned a few potatoes into a satisfying dinner. It helped one can of tuna feed 6 people gathered around the table. It carried an inexpensive head of cabbage to a church potluck. It transformed $1 into a pan of tater-tot casserole that many children would still remember years later. The most valuable part was never the cream soup, the ground beef, or the layer of crispy golden potatoes across the top. What truly mattered was the quiet care of the person standing in front of the oven. Perhaps your grandmother never considered herself a chef. Perhaps your mother never wrote down a complete recipe because everything was measured by eye and by experience. Yet every time they added another layer of potatoes, sprinkled on a few more breadcrumbs, or divided each spoonful of meat a little more evenly, they were placing a simple expression of love into that baking pan. That expression of love never needed to be spoken aloud, but anyone who ever waited for the crispy topping, scraped the golden browned corner of the pan with a fork, or breathed in the aroma of hot cream soup on a winter evening would understand. If your family's dinner table ever held tuna noodle casserole, cheesy potato casserole, green bean casserole, tater-tot casserole, or any other baking pan meal, tell us about it in the comments. Tell us the name of the dish and the person who made it for you. Memories like these are always worth preserving. And if you would like to continue opening those old recipe cards, still resting quietly inside the same tin recipe box from years ago, follow the channel. There are still many more humble dishes that once raised an entire generation, waiting to have their stories told. The last baking pan was finally washed clean, dried, and returned to its old place in the cabinet. The kitchen light quietly went out. Yet somewhere within the aroma of roasted onions, potatoes, hot cream soup, and the gentle sound of a fork touching the edge of the pan, those dinners continue to live on as a quiet way of saying, "I love you."